It was a peaceful Sunday evening in a quiet neighborhood in Virginia. The streets were empty, and most families were inside finishing their dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In this calm moment, Officer Blake was sitting in his patrol car, parked at the corner of Oak Street. He had been on duty for about 6 hours, and honestly, it had been a pretty boring shift. Nothing much ever happened in this area. That's when he noticed a black luxury sedan driving down the street. The car looked expensive, probably worth more than what he made in 2 years. The windows were tinted, not illegal, but dark enough that he couldn't see who was driving. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way the car moved slowly, like the driver was looking around, or maybe it was just his gut feeling telling him something was off. Without thinking too much about it, Blake turned on his lights and pulled out behind the sedan. The car immediately slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. No drama, no speeding off, just a normal stop. But Blake's heart was already pumping. He radioed in the stop, giving the license plate number to dispatch. Then he grabbed his flashlight, even though it wasn't dark yet, and stepped out of his car. As he walked toward the sedan, his right hand naturally rested on his belt, near his weapon. It was just habit, something they taught him at the academy. Always be ready. Always be alert. You never know what might happen. He approached the driver's side window and knocked on it with his flashlight, maybe a bit harder than necessary. The window rolled down smoothly, and Blake found himself looking at a man in his early 50s. He was black, well-groomed, wearing a simple polo shirt that probably cost more than Blake's entire outfit. The man had his hands on the steering wheel, both of them visible, fingers relaxed. He looked calm, too calm for someone who just got pulled over. Most people got nervous, started fumbling for their documents, making excuses. But this guy just looked at Blake with steady eyes, waiting. License and registration, Blake said, his voice sharper than it needed to be. He didn't say good evening. Didn't explain why he pulled him over. Just demanded the documents. The man nodded slowly. Of course, officer. I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's in my back pocket. His voice was deep, educated, the kind of voice you'd hear on the news or in a courtroom. Blake watched as the man carefully reached back and pulled out a leather wallet, then opened the glove compartment for the registration. Every movement was deliberate, slow, non-threatening. Blake took the documents but barely looked at them. Instead, he was studying the man's face, trying to figure him out. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone making it clear he suspected something. "I live here," the man replied simply. "I'm just coming home from visiting my sister in Maryland. It's been a long day and I'm looking forward to getting inside." Blake snorted. "You live here? In this neighborhood?" He looked around at the nice houses, the perfect lawns, the BMWs and Mercedes in the driveways. Then he looked back at the man. "Which house exactly?" The driver's jaw tightened just a bit, but his voice stayed calm. "The 2-story colonial at the end of this street. Number 42. I've lived there for 3 years. Uh-huh," Blake said, not believing a word. "And this car? It's yours?" "Yes, officer." "It's mine. Bought and paid for." Blake walked slowly around the car, shining his flashlight through the windows, looking for anything suspicious. The car was clean, too clean. Leather seats, not a piece of trash anywhere. The back seat was empty except for a small gym bag. "You mind if I search the vehicle?" Blake asked, though it sounded more like a demand than a question. The man took a slow breath. "Actually, officer, I do mind. Unless you have probable cause, I'd prefer you didn't. I haven't committed any crime, and I'd like to know why you pulled me over in the first place." That attitude rubbed Blake the wrong way. People who knew their rights always made his job harder. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he shot back. "I pulled you over because you were driving suspiciously. Now you can cooperate, or I can make this a lot more difficult for you." The man didn't argue back. He just sat there, hands still on the wheel, looking straight ahead now. His face showed nothing, but if you looked close enough, you could see the disappointment in his eyes. He'd been through this before. Maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. And he was tired of it. Blake called for backup. He told dispatch he had a suspicious individual and needed another unit. It wasn't really necessary, but he wanted to make a point. Show this guy that he couldn't just roll through this neighborhood like he owned the place. Within 5 minutes, 2 more patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing, turning the quiet street into a scene. The man in the sedan just sat there, waiting, knowing that getting angry or defensive would only make things worse. He'd learned that lesson a long time ago, so he waited, hands visible, expression neutral, while Officer Blake stood by his door, feeling satisfied that he'd found something worth investigating on his otherwise boring shift. But Blake hadn't looked carefully at that license. He hadn't read the name. He hadn't noticed the address that matched exactly what the driver had said. He was too busy being suspicious, too busy assuming, too busy seeing what he expected to see instead of what was actually in front of him, and that mistake was about to change everything. The flashing lights from 3 patrol cars now lit up the entire street. Neighbors started coming to their windows, pulling back curtains to see what was happening. Some even stepped out onto their porches, phones in hand, ready to record if things got interesting. This kind of thing didn't happen often in their quiet neighborhood, and people were curious. Officer Blake felt a surge of confidence now that backup had arrived. He wasn't alone anymore. 2 other officers, Chen and Williams, got out of their cars and walked over. Chen was younger, maybe late 20s, and had only been on the force for 2 years. Williams was older, more experienced, a woman who'd seen just about everything in her 15 years wearing the badge. "What have we got?" Chen asked, looking at the expensive car and then at the well-dressed man sitting calmly inside it. "Guy claims he lives in this neighborhood," Blake said with a smirk. "Says this is his car. I'm not buying it. Something's off about the whole situation." Williams walked closer to the window and looked at the driver. She saw a middle-aged man, tired eyes, polo shirt, hands still on the wheel. Nothing about him screamed criminal. Nothing about the situation seemed dangerous. She glanced at Blake with a questioning look. "What was the initial reason for the stop?" Blake hesitated. "Suspicious behavior. Driving slowly, looking around, tinted windows. You know how it is." Williams knew exactly how it was. She'd seen Blake do this before. He had a pattern, a habit of pulling over certain people for reasons that didn't quite add up in the report later. But she also knew that speaking up too quickly could create problems for her. The thin blue line was real and crossing it had consequences. "Sir," Blake said loudly, bending down to the window again, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Why?" the man asked calmly. "I've given you my license and registration. Everything is in order. You still haven't told me what traffic violation I committed." "Don't make this difficult," Blake warned. "Step out of the car, now." The man took a deep breath. He knew he had rights. He knew this stop was wrong. But he also knew that arguing with 3 police officers on a dark street could end very badly for him. He'd seen the news. He knew the statistics. So he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, Blake immediately told him to put his hands on the hood of the car. The man complied, spreading his hands flat on the warm metal. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and in good shape for his age. Blake started patting him down, roughly checking for weapons while Chen watched and Williams stood back, her hand resting on her own belt. "You carrying anything illegal? Drugs, weapons?" Blake asked, his hands moving over the man's pockets. "No, officer. Nothing illegal. We'll see about that." Blake opened the driver's door wide and started looking through the car. He opened the glove compartment, checked under the seats, felt around in the door pockets. He was looking for anything, any reason to justify this stop. But the car was clean. No drugs, no weapons, not even an empty beer can. Chen picked up the license that Blake had tossed on the hood. He looked at it more carefully than Blake had. His eyes narrowed as he read the name. Then he looked at the address. It matched what the driver had said. The license was from Virginia Current, no restrictions. The photo matched the man standing in front of them. Everything was legitimate. "Blake," Chen said quietly, trying to get his attention, "I think you should look at this." "In a minute," Blake snapped. He was now looking through the gym bag in the back seat. Inside were workout clothes, a towel, running shoes. Normal stuff. Nothing suspicious at all. His frustration was growing. This stop was turning out to be a waste of time. And now he looked like he'd overreacted in front of his fellow officers and half the neighborhood. Williams pulled out her phone and typed the man's name into Google, just out of curiosity. When the results loaded, her eyes went wide. She looked at the man standing by the car, then at her phone, then back at the man. "Oh no," she whispered. "Blake, you need to see this. Right now." But Blake was too proud to listen. He'd committed to this stop and he wasn't about to back down. "I'm conducting an investigation," he said. "This car doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Something's not right here, and I'm going to figure out what it is." The man finally spoke up, his voice still calm but with an edge of frustration. Officer, I've been patient. I've cooperated with everything you've asked. But this is harassment. You pulled me over without cause, you've searched me and my vehicle without permission or probable cause, and you're keeping me here for no legitimate reason. I'm asking you now, am I being detained or am I free to go? Blake's face turned red. You're being detained until I say otherwise. And if you keep running your mouth, I'll add obstruction to the list of charges. Charges? The man repeated, his eyebrows raising. What charges? I haven't done anything wrong. How about we start with resisting arrest? Blake threatened, moving closer to the man in an intimidating way. That's when Williams stepped directly between them. She'd had enough. Blake, stop. Right now. She held up her phone so he could see the screen. Look at who you just pulled over. Look at his name. Look at what he does for a living. Blake glanced at the phone, annoyed at the interruption. But as his eyes focused on the screen, as he read the headline of the news article Williams was showing him, all the color drained from his face. He looked at the phone, then at the license, then at the man standing by the car. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands started shaking slightly. The man by the car just stood there waiting, his expression neutral. He'd wondered how long it would take them to figure it out. He hadn't wanted to use his position, hadn't wanted to be that guy who throws his weight around. He'd hoped that being calm and cooperative would be enough, but clearly it wasn't. Blake's hand trembled as he held the phone Williams had given him. The screen showed a news article from just 3 weeks ago. The headline read, FBI Director Speaks on Civil Rights Enforcement. And there, in the photo, wearing a suit and standing behind a podium with the FBI seal, was the same man currently standing next to the black sedan with his hands on the hood, Director James Mitchell, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire country. And Blake had just treated him like a common criminal. Chen stepped closer and saw the article too. His face went pale. Oh man, he whispered. Blake, what did you do? The street felt different now. The air seemed heavier. The neighbors on their porches were still watching, still recording on their phones. Those videos would probably be on social media within the hour, maybe the news by tomorrow. This wasn't just a bad traffic stop anymore. This was national news waiting to happen. Blake's mind was racing. He tried to think of a way out, some explanation that would make this okay. But there wasn't one. He'd pulled over the FBI director for no reason. He'd been aggressive, accusatory, and had ordered him out of his car and searched him. All without any probable cause. All because of assumptions he'd made the moment he saw a black man in an expensive car. Williams took her phone back and walked over to Director Mitchell. Sir, I am so sorry. This should never have happened. You're free to go, of course. We apologize for the inconvenience. Mitchell lowered his hands from the hood and turned to face the 3 officers. His expression wasn't angry. It was something worse than angry. It was disappointed, tired, like he'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Free to go, he repeated quietly. Officer, I've been free to go this entire time. I haven't committed any crime. I didn't break any traffic laws. The only reason I'm standing here right now is because your colleague decided I looked suspicious. He said the last word with a touch of bitterness that cut through the evening air. Blake finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. Sir, I didn't know who you were. If I had known. Stop, Mitchell interrupted, holding up his hand. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you thought it was okay to treat me this way. But here's the thing, officer. Every black man you pull over without cause is somebody. We're all somebody's father, brother, son. We all matter. The fact that I happen to be the FBI director shouldn't change how you treat people during a traffic stop. The words hung in the air like smoke. Chen looked down at his shoes. Williams nodded slowly, knowing Mitchell was absolutely right. Blake opened his mouth to defend himself, but couldn't find any words that would help. A 4th patrol car pulled up. Out stepped Sergeant Rivera, a stocky man in his 40s with gray starting to show in his hair. He'd been a sergeant for 8 years and had dealt with his share of problems, but nothing quite prepared him for the scene he was walking into. He saw the expensive car, the 3 officers standing around looking uncomfortable, and a well-dressed man who seemed way too calm for someone being detained. Somebody want to tell me what's going on here? Rivera asked as he approached. Williams met him halfway and spoke quietly, but Mitchell could still hear every word. Sarge, we have a situation. Blake pulled over Director James Mitchell of the FBI. No probable cause. He's been detained for about 20 minutes now. Rivera's eyes went wide. He looked past Williams at Mitchell, then at Blake, then back at Mitchell. The FBI director? That Director Mitchell? That's correct, Sergeant, Mitchell said, his voice steady. I was driving home when Officer Blake here decided to pull me over. I'm still waiting to hear what traffic violation I committed. Rivera walked over to Blake, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. What were you thinking? He hissed. Quiet enough that the neighbors couldn't hear but loud enough that all the officers could. What possible reason did you have for this stop? Blake's face was red now, a combination of embarrassment and defensive anger. He was driving slowly through the neighborhood. The car has tinted windows. I thought he looked suspicious. I was doing my job following my instincts. Your instincts? Rivera repeated, his voice rising slightly. Your instincts told you to pull over a man who's breaking no laws in his own neighborhood, driving his own car? Those instincts? Mitchell watched the exchange with that same tired expression. He'd seen this dynamic before, too. The lower-ranking officer who makes the mistake, and the supervisor who has to clean up the mess. What he wanted to see was accountability. Real accountability, not just anger because he happened to be someone important. Sergeant, Mitchell said, drawing Rivera's attention, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not upset because I'm the FBI director and these officers didn't recognize me. I'm upset because this happens every single day to Black Americans across this country. We get pulled over for looking suspicious or not fitting the neighborhood, or 100 other reasons that have nothing to do with actual law enforcement, and everything to do with the color of our skin. Rivera nodded. I understand, sir. And I assure you, this will be dealt with appropriately. We'll file a full report, and there will be an investigation into this incident. Will there? Mitchell asked, his tone challenging but not aggressive. Because I've read the statistics, Sergeant. I know how many complaints get filed against police officers every year, and I know how few of them result in any real consequences. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about your assurances. The neighbors were still watching. Some had moved closer, standing at the edge of their lawns. A few recognized Mitchell now and were whispering to each other. This was going to be the talk of the neighborhood for months. Blake stood off to the side, his earlier confidence completely gone. He kept replaying the stop in his head, thinking about what he'd said, how he'd acted. If he'd just looked at the license properly, if he'd just asked a few questions and let the man go. But he hadn't. He'd let his assumptions take over, and now his career was probably over too. Chen felt sick to his stomach. He'd gone along with it, hadn't questioned Blake's judgment, hadn't spoken up when he should have. That made him complicit. Williams at least had tried to stop it, but even she felt guilty for not doing more sooner. Mitchell took a deep breath and looked at his car. All he'd wanted was to get home, maybe watch a movie, relax after a long weekend. Instead, he was standing on his own street, surrounded by police officers being treated like a criminal. And the worst part? He knew that for millions of Americans this wasn't unusual. This was just Sunday evening. The evening had grown darker now and the streetlights had flickered on. The flashing blue and red lights from the patrol cars created strange shadows across everyone's faces. Sergeant Rivera pulled out his own phone and started making calls. This situation was way above his pay grade, and he knew it. He needed to notify the captain immediately, maybe even the chief. This wasn't just going to be an internal matter. This was going to involve lawyers, the media, probably even City Hall. Blake stood frozen near his patrol car, watching everything unfold like a bad dream. He kept thinking that maybe he'd wake up and none of this would be real. But the sick feeling in his stomach told him it was very, very real. His career, his reputation, maybe even his freedom, all of it was on the line now. And for what? Because he couldn't let a black man drive through a nice neighborhood without harassment. Chen approached Mitchell cautiously. Sir, I want to apologize. I should have checked your identification more carefully when I first looked at it. I should have said something sooner. Mitchell looked at the young officer and saw genuine regret in his eyes. You know what the real problem is, officer? It's not that you didn't recognize me. It's that this entire stop happened in the first place. Even if I was just a regular citizen, this would still be wrong. The badge doesn't give you the right to stop people based on assumptions and stereotypes. I know, sir. You're right, Williams joined them, her arms crossed. For what it's worth, Director Mitchell, there are a lot of good officers out there who would never do something like this. We're not all like Blake. Mitchell nodded slowly. I know that. I've worked with plenty of good police officers over the years. But the problem isn't just the bad officers. It's the system that protects them. It's the culture that looks the other way. It's the fellow officers who see something wrong and stay silent because they don't want to be seen as disloyal. Williams felt that comment hit home. She had stayed silent about Blake's behavior before. She'd seen him make questionable stops, heard him make comments that crossed the line, but she'd never filed a complaint. Never spoke up officially. She'd told herself that it wasn't her place, that she didn't want to cause problems. Now she was seeing the cost of that silence. More cars were arriving. A black SUV pulled up and out stepped Captain Anderson, a tall woman in her early 50s who'd worked her way up through the ranks. She spotted Mitchell immediately and walked straight to him, her face serious. "Director Mitchell, I'm Captain Anderson. I've been briefed on what happened here, and I want to offer my sincere apologies on behalf of the entire department. This stop should never have occurred, and I assure you we will conduct a thorough investigation." Mitchell shook her hand. "Captain, I appreciate that, but I need you to understand something. I don't want special treatment because of my position. What I want is for this department to take a hard look at why this happened and what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." "I understand completely, sir." "Do you?" Mitchell asked, his voice gentle but probing. "Because I've been on the law enforcement side of these conversations for over 25 years. I know how these investigations usually go. There's a lot of talk about accountability and change, but rarely any real action. Officer Blake over there probably has complaints against him already. Am I right?" Anderson's face tightened. She didn't answer directly, which told Mitchell everything he needed to know. "That's what I thought," Mitchell continued. "So here's what I'm asking for. I want every piece of body camera footage from this stop. I want the dashcam video. I want a complete investigation, not just into this incident, but into Officer Blake's entire record. And I want transparency. The public has a right to know what happened here. Sir, I'm not sure I can authorize the release of all that information." "There are policies." "Captain," Mitchell interrupted, his voice taking on the authority of his position for the first time. "I've spent my career enforcing civil rights laws. I know exactly what you can and cannot authorize. And I'm telling you right now that this incident is going to be investigated properly, by the book, with full transparency. If your department can't do that, then I'll bring in the Justice Department to do it for you. Is that clear?" Anderson swallowed hard. "Crystal clear, sir." Blake had been listening to all of this from a distance, and the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just going to be a slap on the wrist or a note in his file. This was career-ending. Maybe worse. If the Justice Department got involved, he could face federal charges for civil rights violations. His pension, his freedom, everything was at risk. Rivera walked over to Blake and spoke quietly. "You need to get back to the station. Turn in your badge and gun. You're suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. Sarge, please." "I can explain." "There's nothing to explain. Blake, you pulled over a man without cause. You treated him like a criminal, and you did it all on camera. Multiple cameras, including phones from half the neighborhood. Whatever happens next is out of my hands." Blake looked around at the growing crowd of officers and neighbors. He saw the judgment in their eyes. Some looked angry, others disappointed. Nobody was on his side. He walked slowly to his patrol car, got in and sat there for a moment with his head in his hands. Then he started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the scene that would define the rest of his life. Mitchell watched him go, feeling no satisfaction. He'd dealt with officers like Blake before. Sometimes they learned from their mistakes and became better people. More often, they just became bitter and blamed everyone else for their problems. Only time would tell which path Blake would choose. Captain Anderson was on her phone now, probably talking to the chief or maybe the mayor. This incident was going to make waves, and everyone in the city government would want to get ahead of the story. They'd want Mitchell to stay quiet, to let them handle it internally, but he'd already decided that wasn't going to happen. Chen approached Rivera. "Sarge, what's going to happen to us?" "Williams and me, I mean. We were here too," Rivera sighed. "That depends on what the investigation finds. You'll both have to give statements. If it turns out you enabled Blake's behavior or failed to intervene when you should have, there could be consequences. But right now, just go back to the station and wait for instructions." Williams overheard the conversation. "Sergeant, for the record, I tried to get Blake to look at the identification. I tried to stop him, But I should have done more. I should have physically intervened if necessary. That'll be part of your statement, Rivera said. Go on, both of you. Get out of here. As Chen and Williams left, the street finally started to clear. The neighbors slowly went back inside their homes, though they'd be talking about this for weeks. Mitchell stood by his car, looking at his house just a few yards away. He'd been so close to home when this started, so close to peace and quiet. Instead, he'd gotten a reminder of why his job mattered, why the fight for civil rights and equal justice was far from over. Captain Anderson finished her call and walked back to Mitchell. The chief wants to meet with you tomorrow morning if you're available. He wants to discuss this situation and hear your concerns directly. I'll be there, Mitchell said. But Captain, understand this. I'm not looking for revenge. I'm not trying to destroy your department. What I want is change. Real, meaningful change. Training that actually works. Accountability that means something. A culture where officers like Blake can't keep doing what they've been doing. Anderson nodded. I want that too, sir. I really do. Mitchell finally got back in his car. The engine started smoothly, and he drove the remaining 100 yards to his driveway. As he pulled in and turned off the engine, he sat there for a moment in the darkness thinking about everything that had just happened. Then he got out, grabbed his bag from the back seat, and walked into his house. Tomorrow would be a long day. Tonight, he just needed to rest and figure out his next move. Monday morning came too quickly. Mitchell had barely slept, his mind replaying the events from the previous evening. He'd called his wife, who was visiting their daughter in California, and told her what happened. She'd been furious, wanting to fly home immediately, but Mitchell convinced her to stay. This was something he needed to handle himself, and making it a family drama would only complicate things. By 7 in the morning, his phone was already ringing. News had spread fast. A neighbor's video had been posted on social media around midnight, and by morning it had over 2 million views. The headlines were everywhere. FBI director racially profiled in his own neighborhood. Top law enforcement official pulled over without cause. The traffic stop that shows America's policing problem. Mitchell's assistant called to tell him that his office was being flooded with media requests. Everyone wanted a statement, an interview, his thoughts on what happened. But Mitchell wasn't ready to talk publicly yet. First, he had that meeting with the police chief. At 9 o'clock sharp, Mitchell walked into the police headquarters. Officers in the lobby recognized him immediately, and he could see the looks on their faces. Some showed respect, others embarrassment, a few showed defensiveness. He kept his expression neutral and professional as he was escorted to Chief Thompson's office on the 3rd floor. Chief Thompson was a career officer, someone who'd spent 35 years working his way up from beat cop to chief. He was well respected in the community, known for being tough but fair. When Mitchell entered the office, Thompson stood up immediately and extended his hand. Director Mitchell, thank you for coming. Please sit down. Mitchell shook his hand and took a seat across from the chief's desk. Captain Anderson was there too, along with a lawyer from the city attorney's office. This was serious. Thompson didn't waste time with small talk. Director, what happened last night was unacceptable. Officer Blake's conduct was far below the standards we expect from our officers. I want you to know that we're taking this matter very seriously. I appreciate that, Chief Thompson, but I need to know exactly what taking it seriously means. What happens now? Thompson leaned forward. Officer Blake has been suspended without pay, pending the completion of our internal investigation. We're reviewing all of his body camera footage from the past year, looking for any patterns of misconduct. We're also interviewing community members to see if there have been other complaints that weren't properly documented. And what about Officers Chen and Williams? They were present during the entire incident. They're being questioned as well. Anderson interjected. We need to determine if they should have intervened sooner, if they enabled Blake's behavior in any way. But from what we can see, Officer Williams did try to stop the situation once she realized what was happening. Mitchell nodded. That's true, she did. But the question is, why did it take so long? Why didn't she speak up the moment Blake pulled me over without cause? The room went quiet. That was the uncomfortable question nobody wanted to answer, because everyone in that room knew the answer. Officers were trained to back each other up, to show a united front. Speaking out against a fellow officer, even when they were wrong, was seen as betrayal. It was the code that protected bad officers and made good officers complicit. Thompson cleared his throat. Director, I won't make excuses. There's a culture problem in law enforcement, and we're not immune to it. Officers are afraid to speak up because they worry about being labeled as disloyal or becoming outcasts in their own department. That needs to change. What it absolutely does, Mitchell agreed, and this is your opportunity to change it. Not just in this department, but to set an example for departments across the country. Because, Chief, you know this is going to be national news. Everyone is going to be watching how you handle this. The lawyer from the city attorney's office shifted uncomfortably. Director Mitchell, we'd like to discuss how we can resolve this matter quietly and efficiently. Perhaps we could offer you a formal apology, some form of compensation and assurance that Officer Blake will face appropriate discipline. Mitchell looked at the lawyer with a steady gaze. Let me be very clear about something. I'm not interested in compensation. I'm not interested in a quiet settlement. What happened to me last night happens to thousands of Black Americans every single day, and most of them don't have the power or position to fight back. I'm going to use my platform to make sure this incident leads to real change. With all due respect, sir, the lawyer continued, making this a public spectacle could be damaging to everyone involved, including you. The media will dissect every detail. Your name will be in the headlines for weeks. Is that really what you want? What I want, Mitchell said, his voice firm, is for the next Black man who gets pulled over in that neighborhood to be treated with dignity and respect. What I want is for officers like Blake to face real consequences, not just paid vacation and a transfer to another department. What I want is accountability. Thompson raised his hand to stop the lawyer from responding. Director Mitchell is right. This is our chance to do the right thing, and we're going to do it. Full transparency, complete investigation, public release of findings, whatever it takes. Mitchell could see the lawyer wince at those words. Public release meant lawsuits, media criticism, political pressure. But Mitchell also saw something in Thompson's eyes that gave him hope. The chief actually meant it. He was genuinely committed to handling this properly. There's something else, Mitchell said. I want to see Officer Blake's personnel file. I want to know if there have been previous complaints, previous incidents, because my gut tells me this wasn't his first time. Anderson and Thompson exchanged glances. Finally, Anderson spoke. There have been complaints. 3 in the past 5 years. All involved allegations of racial profiling during traffic stops. All were investigated internally and deemed unfounded. Unfounded, Mitchell repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Were they really unfounded, or were they just not properly investigated? That's what we need to determine, Thompson admitted. Looking back now with fresh eyes, I think some of those investigations might have been incomplete. We might have given Blake the benefit of the doubt when we shouldn't have. Mitchell stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Blake was probably sitting in his house worried about his future. Other officers were going about their shifts, some of them probably engaging in the same kind of behavior Blake had shown last night. And regular citizens, especially Black and brown citizens, were just trying to live their lives without being treated like criminals. Here's what I propose, Mitchell said, turning back to face the room. Your department conducts its investigation, and I'll have the Justice Department conduct a separate one, not to undermine your work, but to ensure independence and credibility. When both investigations are complete, we hold a joint press conference and release the findings publicly. Thompson thought about it for a moment, then nodded. I can agree to that. I also want your department to implement mandatory bias training, not the usual one-day seminar that everyone sleeps through. Real training, ongoing training, with accountability measures built in. Done. And I want a civilian review board established with real power to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. Not an advisory board that gets ignored. A board with teeth. Thompson hesitated on that one. Civilian oversight was always controversial. Police unions hated it, arguing that civilians didn't understand the complexities of police work. But Thompson also knew that trust between police and community was broken in many places, and this could help repair it. I'll propose it to the city council, Thompson said. I can't promise they'll approve it, but I'll fight for it. Mitchell walked back to his chair and sat down. That's all I can ask for. Now I need copies of all the body camera and dash cam footage from last night. I also want the names of the other complainants who filed reports against Blake. I'd like to speak with them personally. Anderson made notes. We'll get you everything by end of day. As the meeting was wrapping up, Thompson stood and extended his hand again. Director, I know words aren't enough, but I'm truly sorry for what happened to you. You deserved better. Everyone deserves better. Mitchell shook his hand. Thank you, Chief, I appreciate that. And I hope you understand that I'm not doing this to hurt your department. I'm doing this because change only happens when people are forced to confront uncomfortable truths. As Mitchell left the headquarters and walked to his car, he noticed several officers watching him. Some looked away quickly, others nodded respectfully. He wondered what they were thinking. Did they support what Blake had done? Did they see themselves in him? Or were they embarrassed by how their colleague had behaved? His phone buzzed with a text from his deputy at the FBI. The media requests were still pouring in. Mitchell knew he'd have to make a statement soon. But first, he needed to see that footage for himself. He needed to watch the entire incident from beginning to end, to understand exactly what had happened and how it could be prevented in the future. By Tuesday afternoon, Mitchell sat in his home office watching the body camera footage for the third time. Each viewing made him more certain that this wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about a system that had failed repeatedly. The footage showed everything clearly. Blake's aggressive tone from the very beginning, his refusal to explain the reason for the stop, his dismissive attitude when Mitchell tried to assert his rights. It was all there, recorded in perfect clarity. What bothered Mitchell most was how routine it all seemed. Blake didn't act like someone doing something wrong. He acted like this was just another day at work. Pull over a black driver, assume the worst, intimidate them into compliance. Mitchell had seen the statistics. He knew that black drivers were pulled over at much higher rates than white drivers. He knew that these stops often escalated unnecessarily. But seeing it happen to himself, watching it from the outside, made it all more real. His phone rang. It was the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. They'd already begun their investigation and wanted to interview him formally. Mitchell agreed to come to their offices the next day. He also agreed to speak with several reporters who'd been requesting interviews. The story needed to be told and told correctly. Meanwhile, Officer Blake was discovering just how quickly life could fall apart. He'd been suspended without pay, which meant no income. His wife was furious with him. Not just because of the financial strain, but because she'd warned him about his attitude toward certain people. She'd told him his biases would get him in trouble someday. Now that day had come. The police union had assigned him a lawyer, but even the lawyer seemed pessimistic about his chances. The evidence was overwhelming, and the victim wasn't just anyone. The FBI director had resources and influence that made this case impossible to sweep away quietly. Blake sat in his kitchen, scrolling through social media on his phone. The comments were brutal. People calling him racist, demanding he be fired, some even suggesting he should face criminal charges. His address had been leaked online, and he'd received several threatening messages. His wife had taken their kids to stay with her mother until things calmed down. What Blake couldn't understand was why everyone was so upset. He'd just been doing his job, following his instincts. Sure, maybe he'd been a bit aggressive, but policing was a tough job. You had to be firm, had to establish control of situations. That's what they'd taught him at the academy. That's what his training officers had shown him when he was a rookie. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to look, Blake knew the truth. He'd pulled Mitchell over because of the color of his skin, not because of any traffic violation, not because of any suspicious behavior. Because a black man in an expensive car didn't fit Blake's idea of who belonged in that neighborhood, and that truth was harder to face than any investigation or lawsuit. On Wednesday, the police department released their preliminary findings. Officer Blake had 3 previous complaints of racial profiling, all of which had been investigated and dismissed. But now, with fresh eyes on those cases, investigators were finding problems. Witnesses who hadn't been interviewed, evidence that hadn't been properly considered, reports that seemed designed to exonerate rather than investigate. The 3 people who'd filed those complaints were contacted by Mitchell's team. All 3 agreed to speak publicly about their experiences. The first was a young teacher who'd been pulled over while driving to work. Blake had questioned why she had a car so nice on a teacher's salary, implying she must have gotten it through illegal means. The second was a businessman who'd been stopped in his own office parking lot, with Blake demanding proof that he worked there. The third was a teenager who'd been pulled over while driving his parents' car, subjected to a search, and detained for over an hour while Blake tried to find something wrong. All 3 incidents had been reported, investigated, and dismissed. The pattern was clear. Blake had been doing this for years and the department had looked the other way. Mitchell read through each case file carefully. The investigations had been sloppy at best, deliberately inadequate at worst. In one case, the investigating officer was Blake's former partner. In another, key witnesses weren't even contacted. The system had protected Blake instead of holding him accountable, and Mitchell was determined to expose exactly how that had happened. On Thursday, Mitchell held his first press conference. The room was packed with reporters from local and national media. Cameras flashed as he walked to the podium. He wore a dark suit and a blue tie, looking every bit the federal official he was, but when he spoke, his words were personal. 4 days ago, I was pulled over by a police officer in my own neighborhood while driving home from visiting family. I was not speeding. I was not violating any traffic laws. I was simply driving while black in a neighborhood that the officer apparently didn't think I belonged in. He paused, letting that sink in. Now I'm fortunate. I have a position of power and influence. I have resources to fight back. But millions of Americans face similar situations every year, and they don't have those advantages. He went on to detail what had happened, describing Blake's behavior, the lack of probable cause, the aggressive treatment. He showed portions of the body camera footage on screen set up in the room. Reporters took furious notes. Some looked shocked, though Mitchell knew that for many black journalists in the room this story was all too familiar. This isn't about one bad officer, Mitchell continued. This is about a system that allows officers like Blake to continue these behaviors year after year. This is about an investigation process that protects officers instead of seeking truth. This is about training that fails to address implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. This is about accountability that exists on paper but not in practice. The questions came rapid fire. Would he be pressing charges? Was he suing the department? What did he want to see change? Mitchell answered each one carefully, making it clear that his goal wasn't punishment for the sake of punishment. His goal was reform. Back at the police department, Chief Thompson watched the press conference on his office television. Every word Mitchell spoke was true, and Thompson knew it. His department had failed. Not just in this one incident, but systematically over years. Officers like Blake had been enabled by a culture that valued loyalty over integrity. Thompson made a decision. He called an emergency meeting of all supervisors and announced a complete overhaul of their complaint investigation process. He suspended 2 other officers who'd been involved in dismissing complaints against Blake. He announced mandatory retraining for every officer in the department, starting immediately. And he personally called each of the 3 previous complainants to apologize. It wasn't enough. Thompson knew that. But it was a start. Officer Williams sat in an interview room giving her statement to Internal Affairs. She told them everything. How she'd tried to get Blake to look at the identification. How she'd shown him her phone with the news article. How she'd felt powerless to stop what was happening because Blake was senior to her and she didn't want to cause a scene that might make things worse. The investigator listened carefully and then asked the hard question. Why didn't you file a report about Officer Blake's behavior before this incident? Williams had been asking herself the same question. Because I convinced myself it wasn't my place. Because I told myself he was just having bad days. Because I was afraid of being seen as a troublemaker. She looked down at her hands. I was wrong. I should have spoken up sooner. Chen's interview was similar. He'd witnessed Blake's behavior before, heard him make comments that crossed the line. But he'd stayed silent, telling himself that Blake had more experience, that maybe Chen was being too sensitive. Now he realized his silence had made him part of the problem. By Friday, the situation had evolved from a single incident into a full-scale department review. The mayor announced an independent commission to examine policing practices throughout the entire city. The city council fast-tracked the creation of a civilian oversight board with real investigative powers. And the Justice Department expanded their investigation to look not just at Blake, but at the department's entire approach to traffic stops and community policing. Mitchell watched all of this unfold from his office at FBI headquarters. He'd returned to work, though the incident was still dominating his thoughts. His staff walked on eggshells around him, not sure what to say. But Mitchell didn't want their sympathy. He wanted their commitment to the mission. Civil rights enforcement wasn't just a department priority. It was personal now. That evening, Mitchell's wife finally came home from California. She hugged him tightly at the door, not saying anything for a long moment. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "But I'm proud of how you're handling it." Mitchell smiled sadly. "I keep thinking about all the people who go through this and don't have the platform I have. What happens to them? Who fights for them?" "You do," she said simply. "That's why you do what you do. That's why this matters." They sat together on the couch and Mitchell told her everything, not just the facts of what happened, but how it made him feel. The frustration, the anger. 3 weeks had passed since that Sunday evening, and the investigation had uncovered far more than anyone expected. What started as a look into one officer's behavior had turned into a comprehensive examination of the entire department's culture and practices. The Justice Department's team had set up offices in a building downtown, and boxes of files lined the walls. Complaint records going back 10 years. Body camera footage from hundreds of traffic stops. Interview transcripts from dozens of officers and community members. Leading the investigation was Assistant Attorney General Patricia Lawson, a sharp woman in her 40s who'd built her career prosecuting civil rights violations. She'd seen departments with problems before, but what she was finding here troubled her deeply. The patterns weren't just about Blake. They were systemic. Mitchell met with Lawson weekly to review progress. In their latest meeting, she laid out what they'd discovered. Director Officer Blake had complaints filed against him not just 3 times, but 7 times. 4 of those complaints never made it into his official file. They were handled informally by his sergeant at the time, who told the complainants that their concerns would be addressed through additional training. But there was no training, Mitchell said. It wasn't a question. No training. No documentation. No follow-up. The complaints essentially disappeared. Lawson pulled up a chart on her laptop. "We've also found similar patterns with 6 other officers in the department. Multiple complaints that went nowhere. We interviewed some of the complainants and their stories are disturbing. One of those complainants was Vincent Harper, a 42-year-old engineer who'd been pulled over by Blake 2 years earlier. Mitchell had spoken with him personally. Harper described being stopped on his way home from work, questioned aggressively about where he'd gotten his BMW, and made to wait on the side of the road for 45 minutes while Blake ran every possible check on him and his vehicle. When everything came back clean, Blake had let him go without even a warning because there was nothing to warn him about. He hadn't done anything wrong. I filed a complaint the next day," Harper had told Mitchell. "Spent 2 hours at the station filling out forms describing exactly what happened. A sergeant told me they'd investigate and get back to me. I never heard from them again. When I called to follow up, they said the complaint had been resolved internally and the matter was closed." Stories like Harper's were disturbingly common. The investigation found over 30 similar cases across the department. Traffic stops without probable cause, aggressive questioning, prolonged detentions. Almost all of the people stopped were Black or Latino. Almost all drove newer cars and were stopped in predominantly white neighborhoods. And almost all of the complaints had been dismissed or buried. The data told an even clearer story. Researchers analyzed traffic stop records from the past 5 years and found that Black drivers were 3 times more likely to be pulled over than white drivers. Even after controlling for factors like time of day and neighborhood, they were 4 times more likely to have their cars searched. But they were less likely to be found with contraband, which proved that the searches weren't based on legitimate suspicion. Chief Thompson was devastated when he saw the full report. He'd known his department had problems, but seeing the numbers laid out so clearly was overwhelming. "How did I miss this?" he asked during a meeting with his command staff. "How did we all miss this?" Captain Anderson had an answer, though it wasn't comfortable to hear. "We missed it because we didn't want to see it. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting we'd failed in our jobs. Because it's easier to trust officers than to question them." The police union was fighting back hard. Their president held press conferences arguing that the investigation was biased, that it was unfair to judge officers who had to make split-second decisions in dangerous situations. He claimed that the Justice Department was trying to make it impossible for officers to do their jobs effectively. But Mitchell countered those arguments in his own interviews. "No one is saying police work isn't difficult. No one is saying officers don't face real dangers. What we're saying is that those realities don't excuse racial profiling. They don't excuse stopping people without cause. They don't excuse ignoring complaints and protecting officers who abuse their authority. The breaking point came when investigators found emails between supervisors discussing how to handle Blake's complaints. In one exchange, a lieutenant wrote, "Blake's getting heat again from the usual suspects. Let's just document some counseling and move on. We don't need to make this a big deal." Another supervisor replied, "Agreed. Blake's solid when it matters. He's just a bit rough around the edges with certain people." "Certain people," Lawson said when she showed Mitchell the emails. "That's the kind of coded language that enables discrimination. Everyone knows what it means, but it gives them plausible deniability." Those emails were leaked to the press, probably by someone inside the department who was disgusted by what they revealed. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Protests formed outside police headquarters. Community leaders demanded wholesale changes. The mayor faced calls to resign for allowing this culture to persist. Mitchell found himself in an interesting position. People wanted him to be angrier, more aggressive in his demands. Some civil rights activists criticized him for being too diplomatic, for working with the police instead of against them. But Mitchell believed that lasting change required collaboration, not just confrontation. He needed people like Chief Thompson and Captain Anderson on his side, genuinely committed to reform, not defensive and resistant. Officer Blake, meanwhile, had hired a high-profile defense attorney who was crafting a very different narrative. In their version of events, Blake was a dedicated officer who'd made an honest mistake. He'd seen a car that matched the description of a vehicle involved in recent burglaries. He'd conducted a routine traffic stop, and yes, maybe his tone was sharper than it should have been, but he hadn't done anything illegal. The fact that the driver happened to be the FBI director was just bad luck. Mitchell watched Blake's attorney give this explanation on the evening news and shook his head. It was all lies, of course. There were no recent burglaries. Blake's own dashcam showed him calling dispatch about a suspicious vehicle, with no mention of any crime. The attorney was doing what defense attorneys do, creating doubt and sympathy, but the evidence was too strong. The internal affairs investigation concluded after 6 weeks. Their report was over 200 pages long, documenting not just Blake's conduct but the department's systematic failure to address it. They recommended termination for Blake and disciplinary action for several supervisors who'd buried complaints. They also recommended policy changes, training overhauls, and the implementation of an early warning system to identify problematic officers before their behavior escalated. The Justice Department's report came out 2 weeks later. It was even more comprehensive, examining patterns across the entire department. They found evidence of racial disparities in traffic stops, searches, use of force, and arrests. They documented a culture where officers who spoke up about misconduct faced retaliation and isolation. They identified weak accountability systems that made it nearly impossible to discipline officers even when violations were clear. Both reports were released to the public simultaneously. Mitchell stood alongside Lawson, Thompson, and the mayor at a joint press conference to announce the findings. The room was packed, tension thick in the air. Thompson spoke first, his voice heavy with emotion. "These reports confirm what many in our community have been saying for years. Our department has failed to live up to the standards we set for ourselves. We've allowed bias and discrimination to persist. We've protected officers instead of the people we're supposed to serve. That ends today." Lawson outlined the Justice Department's recommendations, which included a consent decree that would place the department under federal oversight until reforms were implemented and sustained. It was a significant step, one that would fundamentally change how the department operated. Mitchell was the last to speak. 6 weeks ago, I was pulled over for no reason other than the color of my skin. That experience was humiliating and infuriating, but it also opened my eyes to something I should have been paying more attention to all along. This isn't just about one bad officer or one troubled department. This is about a national problem that affects millions of Americans every single day. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "We can do better. We must do better. And these investigations show us how. It won't be easy. It won't happen overnight. But if we're committed, if we're willing to face uncomfortable truths and make hard changes, we can create a system where everyone, regardless of their skin color, is treated with dignity and respect by those who are sworn to protect them." As Mitchell left the press conference, reporters shouted questions at him. Would he be satisfied with Blake's termination? Was federal oversight enough? Would he sue the department? He didn't answer. He'd said what he needed to say. Now it was time to let the process work, to see if all these promises of change would actually become reality. He'd been disappointed before, but this time felt different. 4 months after that Sunday evening, Officer Blake stood in a hearing room facing the police commission. The room was smaller than he expected, with fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and cold. His attorney sat beside him, expensive suit and confident posture, but even she knew this wasn't going to go their way. The evidence was too overwhelming, the public pressure too intense. Chief Thompson sat on the panel along with 4 other commissioners. They'd reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every frame of body camera footage. They'd heard from the 3 previous complainants, from Vincent Harper, from neighbors who witnessed the stop. They'd read the Justice Department's report and the Internal Affairs findings. The decision took less than 15 minutes. Officer Blake was terminated from the police force, effective immediately. His pension was suspended pending potential criminal charges. The commission cited multiple policy violations, abuse of authority, racial profiling, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Blake sat there stone-faced as the decision was read. When it was over, he stood, said nothing, and walked out. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his future uncertain. But Blake's termination was just the beginning. 2 of the supervisors who'd buried complaints were also fired. 3 others received suspensions and demotions. The lieutenant who'd written those dismissive emails about certain people was reassigned to a desk job with no supervisory authority. The message was clear. The department was serious about accountability. The harder work was cultural change, and that fell largely to Captain Anderson. She'd been promoted to deputy chief and given the task of overseeing the reform process. It was a massive job. Every policy had to be reviewed. Every training program had to be rebuilt. Every officer had to be evaluated. The new bias training wasn't the usual one-day seminar where officers sat in a room and listened to a PowerPoint presentation. It was intensive, ongoing, and uncomfortable. Officers had to confront their own prejudices, participate in role-playing scenarios, and hear directly from community members about their experiences. Some officers resisted, claiming it was all just political correctness. Others genuinely tried to learn and grow. Officer Williams volunteered to be one of the training facilitators. She shared her own story about the night she'd witnessed Blake's stop of Director Mitchell, about how she'd known it was wrong but hadn't done enough to stop it. Her honesty made an impact. Other officers started opening up about times they'd witnessed questionable behavior, but stayed silent. Chen took a different path. The experience had shaken him so deeply that he decided to leave policing altogether. He enrolled in law school, hoping to become a civil rights attorney. Before he left the force, he gave a speech at the police academy, talking to new recruits about the importance of speaking up, of choosing integrity over loyalty to bad officers. The Civilian Oversight Board was established 6 months after the incident. It had 7 members, all from the community with backgrounds in law, social work, education, and business. They had the power to investigate complaints independently, to review body camera footage, and to recommend discipline. The police union fought it hard, but the city council stood firm. The board's first major case involved an officer who'd used excessive force during an arrest. In the past, the internal investigation might have cleared him with minimal consequences. But the Oversight Board conducted their own investigation, interviewed witnesses the police hadn't talked to, and found that the force was unjustified. The officer was suspended for 30 days without pay. It wasn't just about that one case. It was about sending a signal that accountability was real now. Mitchell continued to follow the department's progress closely. He visited several times, meeting with Chief Thompson and Deputy Chief Anderson to review implementation of reforms. He spoke at the police academy, sharing his story with new recruits and emphasizing the importance of treating every person with dignity. During one visit, Mitchell sat down with a group of young officers, most of them just a few years out of the academy. One of them, a 26-year-old named Torres, raised her hand. "Director Mitchell, some of the older officers say all this reform stuff is making it impossible to do our jobs. They say we're so worried about complaints now that we can't be proactive anymore. What do you say to that?" Mitchell leaned forward. "I'd say that's an excuse, not a reality. Good policing has always been about treating people fairly and with respect. If an officer's idea of being proactive means pulling people over without cause or treating entire communities as suspicious, then yes, we absolutely want them to stop doing that. But there's nothing in these reforms that prevents officers from doing legitimate law enforcement work. He looked around the room at the young faces. You're the future of this department. You get to decide what kind of officers you're going to be. You can either cling to the old ways and repeat the mistakes of the past, or you can embrace these changes and show that it's possible to be both effective and fair. The reforms weren't perfect. There were setbacks and resistance. Some officers left the department, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture. A few filed lawsuits claiming the reforms created a hostile work environment, but slowly, measurably, things began to change. Traffic stop data from the first year after reforms showed improvement. The disparity between stops of black drivers versus white drivers decreased, though it didn't disappear entirely. Complaints about officer conduct dropped by 40%. Community trust surveys showed increasing confidence in the police department. It wasn't transformation, but it was progress. Mitchell was invited to speak at a national conference on policing reform. He stood before an audience of police chiefs, mayors, and civil rights advocates and told his story one more time. But he didn't focus on Blake or the traffic stop. He focused on what came after. Real change is hard, he told the audience. It requires admitting that we've failed. It requires facing uncomfortable truths. It requires giving up power and control to civilian oversight. It requires officers to challenge each other instead of protecting each other. These are not easy things to do, but they're necessary. He showed data from the department's progress, talked about the policies that had been implemented, shared testimonials from community members who'd seen the difference. This is what accountability looks like, he said. Not just punishing officers who do wrong, but creating systems that prevent misconduct in the first place. After his speech, a police chief from a small city in Texas approached him. Director Mitchell, I've got officers in my department who act like Blake did. I know they're a problem, but I don't know how to fix it without tearing the whole department apart. Mitchell looked at him seriously. Then maybe your department needs to be torn apart and rebuilt. Because if you know you have officers abusing their authority and you're not doing anything about it, you're part of the problem. It was a harsh truth, but Mitchell had stopped softening his message. Change required honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. 2 years after the incident, Mitchell drove through that same neighborhood on a Sunday evening. He passed the exact spot where Blake had pulled him over, and for a moment he remembered how he'd felt that night. The frustration, the anger, the exhaustion of it all, but he also thought about everything that had happened since. The investigations, the reports, the reforms, the training, the oversight, all of it born from one traffic stop that should never have happened. His phone rang. It was Chief Thompson. Director, I wanted you to know that we just released our 2-year progress report on the reforms. The data looks good. Really good. I'm sending you a copy now. Mitchell pulled into his driveway, the same driveway he'd been trying to reach that Sunday evening 2 years ago. I'll read it tonight. Thanks for the update, Chief. Thank you, Thompson replied. For not letting us sweep this under the rug. For forcing us to be better. It's been hard, but it's been worth it. Mitchell ended the call and sat in his car for a moment. 2 years of work, and there was still so much more to do. This one department was just a small piece of a much larger problem. But it proved that change was possible, that accountability could be real, that police and communities could find a way to work together based on trust and mutual respect. He got out of his car and walked to his front door. His wife was inside, probably making dinner. His life had mostly returned to normal. He still led the FBI, still worked on civil rights cases, still fought for justice every day. But that Sunday evening had changed him. It had made the abstract personal, turned statistics into lived experience. As he opened his door, Mitchell looked back at the street one more time. It was peaceful now, just like it had been that evening. But he knew that somewhere in America, right at that moment, another black driver was being pulled over for no reason. Another family was experiencing the fear and humiliation of being treated like criminals when they'd done nothing wrong. The work wasn't over. It would probably never be over. But at least now in this one department, in this one city, things were better, and that had to be enough to keep going. to keep fighting, to keep believing that progress, however slow, was still worth the effort.